Were very cold overnight, Cooma -8 in fact. The capital stayed dry today, plenty of sun in Brisbane and 24 degrees. Sydney 21, Melbourne and Hobart were cool but fine. There's a mass of cold air over the southern states and cloud from a trough over the far west. Otherwise, it's clear skies over the north of the country. There's a strong high moving over the southeast. It's dragging cold air over the ACT and another front's moving through the Southern Ocean. The weather's changing a bit for Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne tomorrow with a few showers on the cards. Cold but fine in Hobart and sunny for Darwin. There'll be a few coastal showers in our region as well, but the rain isn't likely to make it too far inland. Another very cold night in Cooma, -5 to 14, Goulburn -2 to 15, and tops of 17 for Yass and Wagga. There'll be some more fog again in Canberra, but with any luck not as severe or long-lasting as today. It'll be another dry day with a top of 17 after -2 overnight. And fog notwithstanding, we'll have exactly 10 hours of sunlight tomorrow. And the front half of the week will be dry, but we'll see some showers developing by about Thursday, continuing on and off until next weekend. Before we go, a brief recap of our top stories, and all bets are off as the TV networks agree to a federal government ultimatum to ban live betting odds during televised sporting games. And European cities are on high alert for copycat attacks after a French soldier was stabbed on a Paris street. And that's the latest from the Canberra newsroom. For more ACT news, you can follow us online or on Twitter at ABC News ACT. I'm Craig Allen. Thanks for your company. Good night.
Next, Whitlam, the power and the passion, then the true story of the underdog that captured the nation's heart, Cliffy, and later Roman Polanski, wanted and desired.
Wednesday. Strap on the safety gear for a wild ride.
I entered Hannah Gadsby. It's an anagram for a shy handbag.
This week, Lawrence Mooney, Justine Clark and Kevin McLeod join Adam Hills tonight. All right. Wednesday, 8:30 on ABC One.
It's a big week on Q&A. Tomorrow, Lawrence Krauss, Jean Robinson, Fred Nile, Amanda Vanstone and Susan Ryan join the panel. And on Tuesday, he was the teenage geek who dropped out of college to program the planet. If you thought you knew everything about the geek who changed the world, think again. Bill Gates joins Tony Jones for an unmissable event. 2 huge nights of Q&A, starting tomorrow on ABC One.
I'm going to run the Sydney to Melbourne ultramarathon.
He took on the impossible.
You're 61 and I will not have my race turned into a farce.
And captured the imagination of the nation.
Every man, woman and child have turned out tonight. Stand up and Cliffy!
The unbelievable true story of endurance.
Mr. Young is in grave danger of killing himself.
And extraordinary determination.
There goes Cliff Young, legend in the making.
Cliffy premieres tonight, 8:30 on ABC One.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that the following program contains images and voices of people who have died.
He was a figure like we'd never seen before. An agent of change. An Orpheus in a bogan underworld.
Someday I hear him calling.
His name generated great emotion.
The only word is euphoric.
Liberation.
Oh, I was elated.
This was pretty heady stuff.
We bought the album.
It was like a Technicolor person had walked out of a black and white movie.
Love and hate in equal measure.
His government will not be remembered kindly.
And there was another scandal, another scandal, another scandal. And I got angrier and angrier.
It did fall apart because it used such unorthodox methods.
And it took my government.
He came with a vision, but had terrible blind spots.
As Prime Minister, he then drove the government off a cliff.
The end of it all was a disaster.
The coup d'etat has succeeded. The putsch has come off.
And when he fell harder than any leader had ever done.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
It's time to tell the story of Gough Whitlam and our tumultuous affair with him. A tale of power and passion. From the moment he arrived in 1952, everything about him was different. Even to his closest colleagues, he was impossible to pigeonhole.
My first impression in the early years is that he was quite a shy person.
Shy to some, to others confident and outgoing.
He did exude strength and intellect and a sense of excitement.
I used to see him, he'd stoop in the Parliament, walking in or out so as not to be so obvious.
He had never worn overalls, never belonged to a union, never spent time on a picket line. But he represented the working man's Labour Party.
I love the fact he was educated. I love the fact he spoke in a patrician voice. I love the fact he was well-read. I found all this inspiring.
He stood out like a pelican in a murder of crows.
He didn't belong to a group of friends. He didn't belong to a faction. He didn't have any political allies in the caucus. He was just Gough Whitlam and a bundle of ideas.
His shortcomings with a lot of Labor people were probably adequately summed up, but the trade union official said, look at him in a hotel bar. Look at him. He doesn't know how to hold a glass of beer properly. He had his little finger out. You know, the worker gets a glass of beer and he grabs it so it won't get away.
Some of the Liberals thought he should be on their side.
Well, his strengths clearly were his capacity for debate, his command of language. He didn't have, universal friendship amongst the Labour Party then.
Beneath the elegant exterior, they saw the occasional flashes of a petulant child.
Barwick, you bumptious bastard. Mr. Menzies, you are masterly at procrastination. William McMahon is a queen. Order.
I first really became conscious of Gough's temperament as the minister at the table when he threw the glass of water at Paul Hassock. I remember one of Kim Beazley's statements, and he said that it was policy by tantrum.
He called everyone comrade, and he was clearly not a communist. The brothers in the Labour Party wondered if the Silvertail was mocking them.
I didn't feel entirely comfortable with Gough for quite a few years. I'm bits and braces working class. That's the fact of life. Gough was very much not just middle class, but upper middle class, and everything about him.
Gough Whitlam had been close to power all his life. He arrived in Canberra as a child in 1927. The new capital was just a converted sheep station, the land of the blowflies. It was the year the new parliament was opened. Melba sang. The stuttering prince and his beautiful wife did the honours. Enormous crowds were expected. 60,000 meat pies were brought from Sydney. But politics didn't pull much of a crowd, and they bought their own lunch. The Whitlams weren't from money. They were bright, hard-working Baptists. His father rose through the public service from night school into a position of great authority, Crown Solicitor. Gough Whitlam saw firsthand the intrigues of Canberra power. His father was a confidant to 7 prime ministers. From him, Gough would form an idealistic vision of serving the public.
Well, 3 things he took from his father: a devotion to the public service, an absolute rejection of racial intolerance, and third, an internationalism. I think those were the 3 things that he just absorbed.
Mother Mattie was almost deaf, which accounted for Gough's exaggerated style of speaking. She was shrewd, witty, and could be cutting when she wanted to be. She believed from the start that her son was bound for greatness. Gough immersed himself in history and the classics, stories of empires built by great men and women, called by destiny. When he volunteered for war, a spark was lit. It fueled a lifelong passion for serving the nation and its future. He had visions of being a leader himself one day, and wondered if that bell would ever toll for him.
The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and a city pauses with other cities and towns throughout Australia to observe the 2-minute silence of Remembrance Day.
For Australians, November 11 was a day of foreboding. It was a bizarre coincidence that his career as a leader would begin and end on this very day.
Doug Everett will be retiring soon. I think you should have a run for the deputy leadership. We'll support you.
Both the beginning and the end were totally unexpected.
Comrade, that's an idea that appeals to me.
At the time, the nation had no idea who Whitlam was, how far-reaching the decision would be, or how much change it was in for. In 1960, Australia was asleep at the wheel. We were in a post-war dream time of suburban houses, backyards, beaches, and dream machines. Just past the suburbs, a fluffy army of 100 million Merinos paid for everything. Prime Minister Robert Menzies towered over the times. It has been known ever since as the Menzies era.
Well, the Menzies era was a time of unprecedented economic expansion after World War II. It's a time when the population grew. It was a time when Middle Australia really asserted itself.
It was a totally different Australia. It was tranquil, which gets pretty close to subservient, if you ask me. You did as you were told, either your parents or your school teachers or your football coach or the Prime Minister.
But not everyone lived in postcard Australia. Many fell through the cracks, struggling with social problems. The Labour Party voiced the rights of the disadvantaged and the working class. It had been out of government for a generation, a basket case of warring factions.
The Labor movement was split, and within the Labor Party itself, you had the right and the left. And it was, in many senses, having a feast on itself.
Leader Doc Everett moved on after losing 3 elections. Arthur Calwell, an old-school firebrand, became the leader.
We mean action, and action we will give.
In February 1960, Gough Whitlam took up the offer to stand as deputy leader. He won the ballot by a whisker. A Protestant when all the other Labour leaders were Catholic, a good foil for Calwell. The 2 men couldn't have been more different.
He was cut from a different mould, Gough Whitlam. I mean, he was seen as a sort of a boy wonder. He was seen as something new and fresh in Australian politics.
The catalyst of change in the 60s didn't come from politics.
Everybody say, everybody do.
When the music changes, said Plato, governments fall. Rock and roll heralded a new generation we'd never met before. The baby boomers found Australia repressed and stitched up. And they weren't even on drugs yet. They were the most clamouring generation in history, and they would be Whitlam's first audience.
I would like to talk to the 400,000 young Australians who will be voting for the first time on November the 30th.
Yes, he was still very square, and most weren't listening to him yet. But the first fans began to notice he was saying something different.
What is the fascination of politics for you?
Yes, I think there are so many things that can only be done through political action. And there are many, many more things which should be done through political action. So it's only through politics, really, that the average man and woman can never have any say in his destiny.
Say most of your generation.
My first sighting of E.G. Whitlam was revelatory for me.
Race Matthews was in his 20s when he heard Whitlam speak for the first time.
And listening to him, my jaw dropped.
The older generation, the people who were in Parliament during the war on both sides, never feel at ease with Asia.
I had not previously heard anybody in politics speak at that level of eloquence, that level of intellectual grasp, and that level of passion.
The main impression I have of Gough is that he was just interested in ideas.
John Menadue was a 25-year-old economist when he became Whitlam's first chief of staff.
What drove him was equal opportunity. Systematically, Gough set about developing a whole range of new policies on education, on housing, on cities, foreign affairs, health. He had a vision of a better Australia, a stronger Australia.
And he had such simple solutions to the big problems that the country faced.
Financial Review said also that the...
And it was impressive.
Any estimate of the cost of his own proposal.
He would present tons of facts as though they were sliding out the back of a big dump truck.
There will only be proper equality of opportunity in our schools, primary and secondary, when the Commonwealth comes in.
It became clear that he was popular in the community. That he wasn't regarded as the typical Labor person or Labor leader, that he was someone different, of intellectual standing, capacity, could present a case.
In 1966, Australia was still stuck in the slow lane. Some things were stirring. The pill was liberating our love lives. The first environmental protests were underway. And buses of students toured the outback protesting for Aboriginal land and citizen rights. Into this world, Gough would stride. The old guard of the Labour Party seemed lost in the past. Even the Conservative Liberal Party made a generational transition.
One becomes tired. One becomes not quite 100%.
After 16 years as Liberal Prime Minister, Robert Menzies retired and tapped Harold Holt as his successor. But changing Labour's old guard was not going to be easy. For old-timers like Eddie Ward, Gough Whitlam was a problem that needed to be managed in a traditional union style.
Eddie Ward was a frontbencher, a very pugnacious ex-boxer. And I think Eddie resented the fact that Gough had become the deputy leader, and there was a terse dispute between the two of them in the corridor outside the office. Eddie swung a punch at Gough. Just grazed his lip. And I heard a bit of noise, heard the door slam, and Gough sort of fingering his lip to see how much damage that had been made.
The present federal executive is composed of incompetent and irresponsible men. They don't...
Gough fought back in his own way. He attacked Labor's old guard on primetime TV.
They feel complete resentment and contempt for them. They know what small men these are.
I just loved this theatrical defiance, and it gave me hope.
He was so elated about this interview. He said it's the best interview I've ever given.
Leader Arthur Calwell was so incensed, he called a meeting to expel Gough Whitlam from the party.
But there are people creeping into the Labor Party today who seem to think that they have the right to set us right. Arthur Calwell said, "We've got the big bastard. He'll be out by 1 o'clock today."
Gough called in a favour from Queensland. Colourful head kicker Jack Edgerton agreed to call his delegates.
And said, "If you do anything to Whitlam, you'll be looking for your balls when you get back here." 2 Queensland votes dropped out of the sack Whitlam thing, and Gough was saved.
Whitlam had survived his first battle. From now on, Gough would say, he would either crash through or crash. They were fateful words and would define his political journey.
But then, of course, something else happened, and that something else was called Vietnam.
It started as a faraway, quiet little war. It would become the generational wedge that would consign the Menzies era to history.
Vietnam was a huge divider of society, and in the early days, whatever people may say now about their positions, you had to be pretty brave to be in opposition to the war and conscription for it.
Menzies committed the Australian military to Vietnam back in 1962. By 1966, the backlash had begun. If you were under 21, you weren't allowed to vote, but you could be shot at. It was called conscription.
And it did feel quite wrong, quite immoral, that people could decide that someone could go to war and risk their life, and they didn't have any right to have any say in it.
As she watched the nightly news from the suburbs, student Jane Carrow tried to understand Vietnam.
And we would see the news footage from Vietnam, and then we would see the moratorium demonstrations all over the world and also in Sydney. So there was this real sense of rebelliousness. And then there was this real sense of these old men. That's how I saw them. They were probably my age now, but that's how I saw them then. These old men just, you know, crossing the reprobates, get a haircut, you know, run the bastards over, all that kind of thing.
More than 5,000 people were at the airport when the President and Mrs. Johnson arrived from Canberra.
By 1966, 1 month before a federal election, the old men brought out US President Lyndon Johnson to reassure us the war was a good thing.
Johnson's visit was a huge sign of confidence for that generation of Australians who'd put their faith in the Alliance. Johnson's presence here for them symbolised the most tangible example of the American guarantee for Australian security.
As the motorcade loomed into sight, scuffling broke out between demonstrators and police.
But for the generation that was coming of age, you know, the younger Australia at that time, you know, the protests were seen as part of this emerging sort of different kind of Australia that didn't necessarily want to be all the way with LBJ.
Vietnam awakened a generation.
It was something that I think on every campus in Australia mobilised people into realising that they had to play a bigger part than simply being opinionated bystanders.
Demonstrations of this kind, and it'll go even better our way.
The Vietnam election of 1966 was a catastrophic defeat for Labour. It spelled the end of Caldwell. He'd been leader since the time of Elvis, and it was now the time of Sergeant Pepper's. The keys to the Labour Kingswood were thrown to Gough Whitlam. He became the leader of the party.
5, 6, 7, 8, stop the war.
And for young people, Labour became the party of principle. They signed up in droves. Gough hit the stage at the perfect moment. But Middle Australia still wasn't sure who was behind the TV makeup.
Could I ask you some personal questions? Yeah. You've been described as a loner, a man who doesn't make close friends. Would you care to comment on that? I'm not very gregarious, that's true enough. A characteristic which some of your critics see as one worthy of note from time to time is that you are impetuous. How do you note that?
Under the provocations I've suffered, I think I'm extraordinarily sweet-tempered and tolerant.
Gough came out of the blue for a lot of us because the so-called faceless men era in the Labor Party meant you didn't know who was running the show. Whitlam decided to tell people in no uncertain terms that the Labor Party was not just for people who were labourers. You could talk about life to Gough, and I think that's what differentiates him in political terms from so many of his predecessors and his successors. He could put politics into a life context, even though he had a pretty cloistered existence himself and upbringing. He understood people who weren't like him.
The outer suburbs, now swelling with young families, European migrants and 10-pound poms, became Whitlam's heartland. The irony was he was more like them than anyone realised. Gough had lived in the Battler Belt for most of his adult life. He married his university sweetheart, Margaret Dovey, and moved to the outer Sydney suburb of Cronulla after the war. As the family grew, Gough suddenly saw life from the real suburbs. No sewerage, no hospital, few schools, and poor transport.
Although they lived in a modest war service home, the Whitlam house was a house of books. It was a steadfast house.
Les Johnson would become Gough's oldest friend. They first met when the towering young candidate knocked on his screen door.
I was a bit overwhelmed when this well-dressed man arrived at my door and asked for me, and I think I was in a pair of shorts or something, and he said he'd had my name and he was campaigning, and he wondered if I could show him around the district, maybe introduce him to a few people. You know, he fraternised. I saw him awkwardly at the dance on a hot night in his coat and tie being swung around by these exuberant ladies, and they jokingly referred to him one night as Twinkle Toes.
Margaret Whitlam would raise the children for long periods single-handedly while Gough was in Canberra.
November 1952 is memorable to me. I had a miscarriage. We got our first car. And Gough won his first election. Margaret Whitlam.
In an era of stay-at-home mums, Gough had chosen a feisty, independent wife who gave as good as she got. She was down to earth, but had high expectations of him, and she was renowned for being his equal.
People felt that in voting for him, they were getting two for the price of one.
She was such a support for him. She was also the sort of person who grounded him, who brought him back to earth sometimes when he needed to be brought back to earth. And she had a really good relationship.
That relationship would often be put to the test, as another young Labor man would find at a local party meeting.
Gough introduced me, and 40 minutes later, he was still introducing me. Margaret's face was an absolute mask of fury. And I went over and she said, "Why doesn't somebody go over there and kill him?" And I said, "Well, that's a bit strong." She said, "Well, the least you can do," she said, "is go over there, stand next to him and shame him into shutting up."
From Cronulla, Whitlam went deeper into the suburbs. He moved the family to Struggletown, Cabramatta, in the outer west of Sydney. This would become Goff's spirit of place. The future of politics was right here. No longer working class, they aspired to more. They were the first swinging voters that would decide the marginal seats. And they would come to rule Australian politics. (1967). For some of us, it was the summer of love. For Gough Whitlam, it was time to make the party dance to a different tune. They'd lost 8 elections in a row. If he was to have any chance of winning, he had to beat his own side first.
When Whitlam was elected leader in February 1967, he said there were 2 things that I was under pressure about. When would I get out of Vietnam and when would I go into Victoria?
The Victorian Party was the last bastion of the hardline left, who wanted to keep power in the unions. Like a famous Shakespearean character, Whitlam spent months wondering if he had the strength to break them.
There's something of Hamlet in him. He used at one stage to be called the Hamlet of Cabramatta. But there was that period when he really had very dark feelings about whether he could bring it off or whether he should make a strategic retreat, whether it should be now, whether it should be later, whether, I'm not sure whether he coined these words, whether to be or not to be.
He chose to attack at the Victorian Conference, declaring war with a cracking soliloquy.
Gough strode into their June 1967 conference. He stood up there with his brilliant teamed hair and his shiny grey suit, narrow lapels, narrow tie, and he told them that they had lived in a philosophy of failure. He said, "We construct a philosophy of failure which finds in defeat a form of justification and proof of the purity of our principles." He said, "Certainly the impotent are pure."
Gough was not cautious that night. And naturally, I wondered how it would play out.
When he got to that "only the impotent are pure" phrase of the speech, the place erupted, but not with applause. Arthur Golwell, who was sitting in the gallery, said to me, "Well, you won't be working for your boss long now."
He was prepared to risk all to get the change that he wanted. And he confronted them as I've never heard him confront a group before. And that was the catalyst and trigger for change.
Looking back, it was an era so repressive it made your eyes water. Vietnam had started it, but now young people took to the streets on many issues.
People wasting away.
Writing his policies, Whitlam rode the wave of anger. He targeted people who felt they'd been ignored by politics. As the 70s approached, many women felt they were second-class citizens.
Most women's lives are structured around repetition. Every day you made the beds in the house, you swept the floors in the house, you prepared the school lunches and things like this. It created for all women, no matter who they were, the opportunity to reflect upon their lives.
I was talking to friends of mine, I remember this vividly, and her father basically said to her, "Well, you can leave school because you're just a girl and we need to keep your brothers at school." And that happened a lot, and she was the one who was actually academically interested and good, and her brothers didn't care.
And so when the Whitlam era opened up the space for voice, when women could start speaking about, were encouraged to start speaking about their lives, it all tumbled out. It's the lamb chop syndrome, they would say. We cook the chops for dinner every night, and the biggest ones go to the husband, and then the next best ones go to the children, and we get the little runt that's burnt.
Whitlam's female staff heard many policy ideas happening around them.
And we used to say to each other, well, you know, we're not paid to think.
But when it came to personal issues like abortion, they got involved.
We had very strong views about some issues, and very occasionally we voiced our views. And this was one occasion they were talking about abortion in the office. And I think Barbara Stewart was one of my work colleagues, leapt to our feet and said, excuse me, but you chaps need to listen to some women on these issues, not talk amongst yourselves.
Here he is, Mr. Whitlam, Mr. Whitlam. Abortion, Mr. Whitlam.
He was known for his wit, and now Whitlam delivered one of his most memorable lines.
Do you have an opinion on it? What is your view? Abortion, Mr. Whitlam.
In your case, comrade, it should be retrospective.
His wit was one thing, but his classical education meant he could relate to a growing new sector of the community, migrants. John Nicolaides was the son of Greek cafe owners.
They found Australia very narrow. I mean, they were told they had to be careful that don't speak Greek on trams. They lived in Melbourne. My mother would tell me when she tried to get olive oil, she would need to go to the chemist shop.
He was absolutely idolised by ethnic minorities. He could meet somebody and say, oh yes, you're so-and-so. Now your family would be from, and identify the region of Greece or Italy from which that person came.
Suddenly a voice I'm hearing sweet to my ear. This is tomorrow calling, wishing you would hear.
Whitlam would champion a new concept, multiculturalism, an Australia for all. Gough wanted to shake Australia up with unheard-of reforms like no-fault divorce, free hospitals, and free universities.
And even at 12, I had a strong sense that these were powerful things.
This is tomorrow calling.
And these were genuine change. These are important things to the country then and in the history of the country.
There was something so liberating about Gough and his approach to the way Australia sits in the world, his approach to the arts, to the Indigenous people.
Gough wanted to include Aboriginal people in his vision for Australia. For years, they'd been in the government's too hard basket. Pat Turner was an 18-year-old in Alice Springs.
Services to Aboriginal people were very rare, and accessing those services in any sort of easy way was a rare experience. So I grew up in that sort of environment, and I could see very clearly the injustice of it.
With so much to do and the 1969 election looming, Gough expected total support for his ambitious platform of reform. When things went wrong, his staff would say he was having a birthday.
Ridiculous! Idiotic! Stupid freedom!
Encountering resistance from the factional leaders, Whitlam did the unthinkable. He quit.
So to our absolute stupefaction, he resigned from the leadership and demanded to be re-elected. Well, at that point, some of us thought the guy was off his rocker.
Left-wing poster boy Dr. Jim Cairns stood against him, and former communist-turned-advertising guru Philip Adams chimed in with a killer line.
And it said, whose party is this, his or ours?
It was a devastating line, because the Labor Party then, I don't think it's so profoundly evident now, was very much into egalitarianism and the thought of elites and so on would alienate them.
When the vote came, had 3 people changed their minds, Whitlam's political career would have been over.
He won, but it was a very close game. That's the first time I voted for him, by the way.
As the 1969 election loomed, the political terrain was changing. Popular charmer John Gorton had become Prime Minister after Harold Holt was lost in the giant surf off Victoria. never to be found. For Gough, the ducks were in a line. The party, the policy, the people. Going into his first election, he had high hopes from his faithful in the satellite suburbs. They looked to a messiah to lead them to free childcare and flushing dunnies.
A lot of it happened out of town. It was a place where land was cheap. And they'd have their wild and sometimes almost orgiastic parties in those houses. And they'd dream of the final escape from the gravitational pull of the Menzies era, where the people weren't simply Whitlam enthusiasts, they were Whitlam worshippers. You're talking about Gough as Pope. These people worshipped Pope Gough.
The most significant trend to emerge from the early counting has been the marked swing to Labour. A swing of 8%.
Philip Adams recreated the moment in a movie where Gough's devotees gathered for election night, 69.
Form the new government. On the present figures, Labour is ahead and could possibly rest the following seats.
Election nights are one of the great festivals of Australia. I love election nights. You can't get enough of them. It's a party, the TV on, you drink a lot, you talk a lot, and you check out Eden Monaro and you go from there.
Oh, to a seat that is very close to where we are now, Eden Monaro, that borders...
In real life, around the Hills Hoist at the Whitlam home in Cabramatta, things were looking very good for Gough. For all the dons around the country, it was the most exciting election night in years.
They're convinced that their hero is going to walk into the lodge that night.
Get outside! That's your age! You don't beat people up just because they take a liking to your wife!
And as the evening progresses, the party turns very nasty and acrimonious and vicious.
Can those bastards get back in? I'm going to shoot myself.
I thought we were winning.
Oh, it's stuff.
Until by the end of Don's party, Don, the central character, is standing alone in his garden. And it was almost as though the Menzies era had reached out and plucked victory from Gough.
Like Don, Margaret would have her own moment in the backyard.
When everyone left the party, I stood under the Hills Hoist and cried. 16 years, and we had just lost for the 9th time in a row. Margaret Whitlam.
All I'd like to say at this moment is that my colleagues and I are very gratified, of course, at the support that the...
Gough may have lost his first election, but he suddenly looked like an alternative Prime Minister.
In every state.
Well, let me say this about Gough Whitlam. I thought he did a tremendous job as the opposition leader, and the way in which he welded the party together and repaired a lot of the rifts and campaigned and developed what he proudly called his program. I thought that was a very effective political exercise.
I tell you, I was impressed with what Whitlam was on about. I think Whitlam's greatest era, greatest campaign was the 69 campaign. And, of course, he made great progress.
As the 60s became the 70s, the US put a man on the moon and brought him back. But we couldn't bring our men home from Vietnam.
Walking on a dusty road in the countryside.
Frustrated by the near victory in the 69 election, thousands took to the street for the biggest demonstrations Australia had ever seen.
Sunshine through the autumn, sweet snow to the spring.
This time it wasn't only radicals and uni students at the barricades. It was soapy stars too. Anne Phelan was an actor on the home and away of the 60s, Bellbird.
And it was the most extraordinary experience. There wasn't much marching going on because there was actually nowhere to march. There was too many people. I remember everyone sitting.
Well, hello there, my friend. I see you're on the road here just like me. Why don't we stop and...
And I even remember the police was so gentle. And a lot of them, of course, were also against the war in Vietnam. So they took on a very laid back, but it was I think it was the peacefulness of it.
Meanwhile, in the Liberal Party, it was anything but peaceful.
Wish me luck as you kiss me goodbye.
They were cracking under the strain of how to withdraw from Vietnam. In doing so, they tore down John Gorton.
So could we ask a question of Mrs. McMahon, how she feels about this?
Billy McMahon became the new Prime Minister, the least electable leader in Liberal Party history.
It was certainly fortunate for Gough Whitlam that he had opponents ultimately like John Gorton and Billy McMahon.
The last link in the chain was a major media backer. Young media mogul Rupert Murdoch had ambitions to be a kingmaker. He could see Whitlam's ascendancy and saw a role for himself behind the throne. John Menadue left Whitlam's staff to become head of Murdoch's company, News Limited.
Gough never wanted to be beholden to anyone. Gough was interested in ideas, and he found Rupert boring. Really boring.
Whitlam had bigger fish to fry. A secret plan was coming to fruition. In 1971, he did something that literally stunned the nation. He headed for communist China, the first Australian political leader to ever go there.
If a fortune teller had told me at the beginning of 1971, this year you will go either to the moon or to China, I would have chosen the moon.
The taint of communism had plagued Labour since the Reds under the beds days of the 50s. He was walking through a political minefield, challenging his critics, seizing his moment.
Well, Whitlam's visit to China is perhaps one of the most dramatic moments in Australian foreign policy history. For 2 decades before that, the consensus in Australian politics was that China was behind the downwards thrust of communism. That China was a source of fear, that China represented an Asia that Australians needed to keep at arm's length. Whitlam, in one fell swoop, broke through that myth about China, and he, in so doing, caused a symbolic and psychological break with Australia's past.
Premier Zhou Enlai met him in the Great Hall in Peking. No one knew what would happen next.
All the U.S. forces of aggression.
Zhou Enlai did set a trap, I think one could say, for Whitlam, subtly inviting him to denounce the American alliance. Whitlam skillfully manoeuvred around.
Had a fine discussion.
Whitlam impressed, but for his critics it was a gift. Prime Minister Billy McMahon said that the Chinese played Whitlam like a trout.
I love the fact that Billy McMahon, the Prime Minister, finished up with a face full of egg, because here he was telling the Australian people, here was this fellow traveller, this man going along and visiting the communists. This was treacherous. And within a matter of weeks, it comes out that Henry Kissinger's over there lining up the Nixon trip. You've never seen so much egg on a Prime Minister's face. It was a beautiful sight.
China was a turning point in more ways than one. Gough had left home without his Brill cream.
And when he came back, his hair was sort of fluffy and soft and curly. And I said to him, oh, I said, Leader, that looks much better. And he said, oh, do you think so? And he never used the product again.
Unwittingly, he had discovered a new image. And soon after, a new slogan.
Time for freedom, time for moving. It's time to begin. Yes, it's time.
For the first time, Australian politics was becoming groovy. Labour assembled an eccentric collection of TV stars, rockers and old comedians to launch their campaign, singing a gospel chant for change.
There was certainly belief that it was time for a change, and there was no rational person could really vote to keep Billy McMahon on as Prime Minister. And when you contrasted the "It's Time" T-shirts that the Labor people were wearing with the best the Liberals could come up with was one saying, "Oh, not yet." I mean, this really pointed up the difference between the two parties and the two attitudes.
Behind the scenes, Rupert Murdoch paid for Labor party ads in all newspapers across the country.
Oh, Rupert was in there, boots and all. Boots and all.
Eric Walsh had resigned as political chief of Murdoch's Daily Mirror to be Whitlam's campaign director on the It's Time campaign. His headquarters was a small flat in Sydney. Rupert visited to check on their progress.
Rupert had come up from time to see how it's going, fellas. You know, are you going to win? Am I going to be close to the Prime Minister? He came in one time, he looked around, he'd had it every night, the night before, the cans everywhere, a couple of dirty plates. He said, when you get there, I hope you look after the country better than you're looking after the unit.
Good evening. Tonight, as Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party, I want to talk to you about the issues on which we will fight this election.
What is the quality that you most admire about Mr. McMahon?
His persistence.
No, you're right. Stuart Harris, I'm sorry.
The 1972 election would prove to be the beginning and the end of a number of political careers.
So we'll go further down the street.
Young Liberal John Howard had been campaigning for the party since 1966. In 1972, he was made an offer he couldn't refuse.
I was asked whether I'd take 8 weeks off from my legal practice to help Bill McMahon's campaign, and I travelled around Australia with him. One of my partners sort of said, "Oh, well, I don't mind you doing it, but John, you realise it's time," which we both laughed at.
It's time. The national leader of the Australian Labor Party, Mr. Gough Whitlam.
Here comes the night.
When the day arrived to launch Whitlam's campaign in the Blacktown Civic Centre, there had never been a political meeting in Australia to equal it.
The long, long red night.
I think the only word, or the best word, is euphoric, because there was a sense that we were on the threshold of victory.
I could see right up now.
I remember sitting around the TV with my family, and there was a sense that this was important, that this man, after so many years, was likely to be not just the next Prime Minister of Australia, but he represented change.
To be with me, oh, it makes me want to die. Yeah, 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 now here it comes.
Men and women of Australia, the decision we will make for our country on the 2nd of December is a choice between the past and the future, between the habits and fears of the past and the demands and opportunities of the future. There are moments in history when the whole fate and future of nations can be decided by a single decision. For Australia, this is such a time.
Tears in my eyes. It's a deeply emotional moment. It was a calling of a new generation to rise to its responsibilities.
We will abolish conscription forthwith. We will abolish fees at universities and colleges of advanced education.
The roof went off. He didn't even have to make a speech. He said, "Men and women of Australia," and they believed him. They thought he stood for them.
We want to give a new life and a new meaning in this new nation to the touchstone of modern democracy, to liberty, equality, fraternity.
It opens the ground, the
Gough was the consummate performer. For a couple of reasons. One, he had great stage presence. Stature, of course, added to that. But he knew his space and he knew how to use it. And he had great wit and he knew how to use that. But that in its own is interesting. What gave him genuine presence was that he himself was genuine. He had, even his enemies would concede this.
I need your help. I need the help of the Australian people, and given that, I do not for a moment believe that we should set limits on what we can achieve together for our country, for our people, for our future.
At last, the bell had tolled. It was his time.
Mr. Whitlam has obviously won, and he's won a handsome victory.
On election night in Cabramatta, Whitlam's home was teeming with true believers.
Oh, there's no other word but electric. We'd done it.
They won, and it was euphoric, and it was fantastic, and everyone was thrilled, and we all thought Australia was going to move into the 20th century at long last.
They were convinced that Whitlam was going to change everything.
All I want to say at this stage is that it's clear that the majority given by New South Wales...
Gough was crammed up against the fireplace as he made his victory speech. For once, he looked a little overwhelmed.
The new government will have a very good mandate to carry out all its policies.
I think it was probably the Monday after the election, and I was sitting with Rupert. He said, how many seats do you think we won, meaning News Limited won, in the election, rather than the Labor Party?
The interesting thing is that it was only just time. There's a mythology about Whitlam's win in 1972, which is, like a lot of mythologies, underserved. He only won very narrowly. And when you think that Labor had been out of office for 23 years, it was quite a narrow squeak, his win.
On Sunday morning, the day after the election, he marched on Canberra.
How does it feel to be Prime Minister-elect?
I'm not used to it yet, I suppose.
How much sleep have you had since last night?
About 4 hours, I think.
Does the job frighten you at all, sir?
Not in the least.
Impatient for change, he threw convention to the wind and created the strangest government in Australian history, a government of two blokes.
Whitlam said, righto, we'll just swear myself and Lance Barnard in to all the existing ministries, and we'll get on drafting regulations. And that's what he did.
Announcements tumbled out each day, a cascade of reforms.
And it was very exciting. I mean, it was quite crazy. Every morning the paper came out with virtually half the front page devoted to what the government did yesterday. You know, after years in which the government had appeared to do absolutely nothing, this was pretty heady stuff.
Right from the start, there were signs that the hubris that had got him there could easily just turn around and eat him.
Gough said it was the best government he ever had, except it was twice as large as it needed to be. I quoted that once, and he got quite put out. He said, I never said that. But he did say it. I heard him say it once, and others did too. It wasn't wise politically, though.
The Whitlams had arrived in Camelot. The kingdom was theirs. The pool was epic. The people euphoric. real challenge for Whitlam would come when his full ministry was sworn in. They'd been in the wilderness for 23 years. None of them had any experience in administering government. He had transformed the party to be elected, and he had created a love affair with many in the public. The true test for Gough Whitlam lay just weeks away.
He stepped off the farm and shuffled into our hearts. The unbelievable true story.
Cliff joins the ranks of the sporting elite.
Cliffy premieres next on ABC One.
Fairfax wants 100 million. The mags make 20 million a year. So on a cost-to-profit basis, it's a bargain. We get our money back in 5 years. We want a revolution at Women's Day, an entirely new product.
So, who do we get to run them?
New Idea is now the dominant market leader in Australia. This person has worked tirelessly at an impressive level. Mr. John Hall.
You're a piece of work.
Is the show finished?
I can't work for you anymore.
We need someone new. Someone at the top of their game.
In the golden years of the Glossies, a war was waged to reach #1.
Do you think you could compete with Dulcie Bowling?
Compete? I'll do more than that.
No story was off limits.
I want you to get into the parties no one else can. I want you to get the shots no one else can.
All the stars, all the stories. I'll put you over the top.
Bid against her.
People will never get it. Packer has deeper pockets.
I don't care. Drive a price up.
And the boundaries were stretched like never before.
This is out of control.
When have people ever seen a topless royal?
Yeah, what if they don't want to see one? I sure as hell don't. At least, not this one. What is he doing to her feet?
My blood runs cold. My memory has just been sold. My angel is the centerfold. Angel is the centerfold.
In the very beginning of celebrity power, Princess Di and the paparazzi, two media moguls fought for supremacy.
You have to spend money to make money.
And at the centre of it all were two remarkable Aussie women.
I love the smell of magazines.
Paper Giants Magazine Wars starts next Sunday, 8:30 on ABC One.
Well, we are 300 metres from the finish line. Joy of winning an Ashes series. Australia has a long list of league sporting victories. First there was Gordon Bradman, then there was Gordon Creighton.
It is my great pleasure today to announce a new major event to be placed on the Australian sporting calendar. I announce to you the Ultra Marathon, the most gruelling marathon in the world, to be run between Australia's two greatest cities, Sydney and Melbourne.
That's over 800k, so are you expecting anyone to finish?
The world's greatest runners are competing. Great men like Joe Record. Siggy Bauer is the world 1,000-mile world record holder. And one of the greatest runners in long-distance history. Fresh back from his record-breaking run across California's Death Valley, Mr. Tony Rafferty.
That's all of them, Sid. You want a cuppa? No, I'll be right. Better get back into my one. Righto.
Hey, Cliffy. What are your pellets?
Anywhere in there's good, mate.
All right, mate. Did you run a bit?
Yeah.
Where do you run to?
Well, it depends where I'm going.
Fair enough. Hey, Cliffy. Janine at the office, she almost didn't let me bring this to you, mate. They need, like, last month's payment, you know? I hate to say it, but I think the old girl's on her last. See you, mate.
Right.
Righto, Cliffy. Give it to her. Come on.
Hey!
Come on, get it.
Des, leave her.
Come on. I've got cattle to pick up over at Glasson's after this, and I've got to be at the meatworks by 2 o'clock, mate. Look at the age of her.
She's been a good cat.
She's that bloody old. Get the road, Cliff. Come on. Cliff!
No, Des, don't. No. Leave her. I've changed my mind.
You are bloody useless. No wonder you can't pay your bloody bills. Your old man will be spinning in his grave. Thanks, Mum.
Now, don't go all soft on me, Cliff, yeah?
Oh, it's looking good.
Oh, none for me, thanks, love.
Really? Have some, Cliff. It won't kill you.
Mum, do we have to do this every time?
Uncle Cliff's a vegetarian.
I've eaten meat my whole life. It's never done me any harm.
I know, Mum.
Why don't you eat meat?
Oh, I had a crook pot of stew once.
Oh, rubbish. To Cliff, everything is a pet.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yes, well, if he'd eat one of his pets now and then, he might get a bit of meat on his bones.
Yeah, it's rare a farmer being a vegetarian.
But you like being a farmer, Cliff?
Of course he does.
All right, salt and pepper, whatever you need.
Righto, ticket.
I thought you might get lucky.
I've done real well, haven't I?
Waiting for the news to come on.
Yeah. They're about to light a bushfire in there, so you might want to see.
Oh, fantastic.
How's school?
And as a
Good.
preview of what's coming up in
Good.
sport, Ron Griffin caught up with legendary runner Tony Rafferty.
So, Tony Rafferty, how do you find the difference in conditions between Ireland and, say, Australia, Tony?
Well, it's probably drier here. It's a lot cooler than Death Valley, that's for sure. I'm looking forward to it. Should be fun.
Desi said you wouldn't sell the cow.
That I go for. See, and it's a fair whack of prize money there, $10,000. Do you think that's going to...
You could have got a couple $100 for her.
Yeah, I know.
What are you doing about spraying the spuds this year? I think you need to. Desi was saying that Simpson lost the bloody lot.
You know how I feel about bringing poison on the place.
Cliff, you can't just turn your back and hope it's going to go away. Bloody thing takes hold, there'll be no stopping it.
I'll look into it.
Will you make sure you do, mate? Because you can't afford to lose another crop.
Right, I see.
Hey, Cliffy. Birthday, mate.
Cut it properly, Cliff.
I'm thinking about my wish.
Oh, I don't know who's going to look after him when I'm gone.
A wealthy widow. That's what you need, Cliff.
You're a pregnant widow. Less work, eh, Cliffy?
Sid.
Cliff's never been interested in that sort of thing, have you, Cliffy?
You see, when we were young bucks, we used to go to dances, right? Oh, Cliffy, you never asked a girl for a dance. Too shy.
Have you seriously never been with a girl?
Oh, well, I've never found the right...
Maybe that's why you run so much. Dad thinks you're mad. I mean...
No, he's probably right.
Sorry.
While I think of it, Cliff, I ran into Betty Thompson the other day. I told her you'd go round and prune her fruit trees.
Oh.
She said you didn't have to, but I insisted.
Well, he can take Sid with him.
No. Cliff can do it.
So, what are you going to wish for, Uncle Cliff?
Oh, can't tell you that. Might not come true.
Strawberry Road has had the run of the race.